I heard you haven't touched a woman in 10 years. That's what she said, loud enough for the whole cafe to hear. Snow was falling, coffee steam curling in the lamplight, when the giant mountain man looked up, and didn't deny it. Folks thought he was just a ghost from the high country, living off pelts and silence. But that night, on the frozen trail, she found him bleeding in the snow beside, a Lakota boy running from men who don't forgive and don't forget. Now, a lonely widow with a ranch on the edge of nowhere, and a man who's sworn off the touch of any woman, are bound by more than a rescue. The railroad wants her water. He's worked for them before, and somewhere between her lamplit kitchen and the bitter wind outside, he's got to choose between vanishing again or standing where bullets might fly. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you are watching from. Seeing your comments really reminds me why I do this every day. The winter morning bit deep as Clara moved between the cafe tables, coffee pot in hand. Steam rose from the dark liquid as she topped off cups, the aroma mixing with wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove. The familiar clink of cups against saucers and low murmur of conversation filled the room. The bell above the door chimed. Clara glanced up to see Eli Gray's massive frame duck through the doorway. Snow dusted his broad shoulders and dark beard. He moved like a shadow toward the counter, his eyes down, avoiding contact with anyone. At a corner table, Mrs. Henderson leaned toward her friend, voice carrying just loud enough. That's him, the one who won't speak to womenfolk. 10 years, they say. Clara's fingers tightened on the coffee pot handle. She'd heard enough whispers about the mountain man to fill a book. Some called him dangerous, others pitied him. All of them talked around him instead of to him. Without really planning to, Clara strode toward his table. I heard you haven't touched a woman in 10 years, she said, loud enough to cut through the chatter. The cafe fell silent. Forks stopped scraping plates. Every eye turned toward them. Eli's head lifted slowly. His deep-set eyes met hers, carrying a weight of sadness that made her breath catch. I don't deserve to, he said quietly. The raw honesty in his voice struck her like a physical blow. Before she could respond, he stood and left, leaving coins on the counter for his untouched coffee. Day grew colder as heavy clouds rolled in. By mid-afternoon, snow was falling thick and fast. Clara wrapped up early, knowing she needed to get home before dark. The wagon wheels crunched through fresh powder as her horses plodded along the familiar road toward her ranch. Through the swirling white, she spotted something dark against the snow. Her heart jumped when she made out a horse grazing nervously by the roadside, steam puffing from its nostrils. Beyond it lay a prone figure, a large man face down in the snow. Whoa! Clara called to her team, pulling them to a stop. She climbed down, her boots crunching in the fresh powder. It was Eli Gray. Blood had frozen in his beard from a nasty gash above his temple. His rifle lay several feet away, as if thrown. A flutter of movement caught her eye. Clara turned slowly, squinting through the falling snow. There, a small figure crouched in the brush. The Lakota boy, Hinto, watched her with wide, frightened eyes. It's all right, she said softly, though she knew he probably didn't understand English. She kept her movements slow and gentle as she checked Eli's pulse, strong and steady, thank the Lord. Getting him into the wagon would be a challenge. Clara was strong from ranch work, but Eli must have weighed twice what she did. She grabbed his shoulders and heaved, managing to turn him onto his back. His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Hinto, she called softly, please help me. The boy hesitated, then crept forward. Together they managed to drag Eli through the snow to the wagon. Clara laid out blankets in the bed while Hinto tied Eli's horse to follow behind. Clara patted the wagon seat next to her. Come on, it's too cold to be out here. Hinto clambered up beside her, wrapping his arms around himself. His thin jacket offered little protection against the bitter wind. Clara shrugged out of her heavy wool coat and draped it over his shoulders. He stared at her in surprise, then gave a slight nod of thanks. The snow fell harder as they drove toward her ranch, the wind picking up to a mournful howl. In the wagon bed, Eli hadn't stirred. Clara kept glancing back at his still form, remembering his words from the cafe. What burden of guilt could make a man deny himself human touch for so many years? What pain lay behind those quiet words? I don't deserve to. She'd find out soon enough, she reckoned. With this storm bearing down, none of them would be going anywhere for a while. Clara clicked to the horses, urging them faster through the thickening white. Behind them, Eli's horse plodded steadily onward, head down against the wind. While in the wagon bed its master lay silent under a growing blanket of snow, Clara's lamp cast a warm glow across the snow as she helped Eli toward the bunkhouse. His massive frame leaned heavily against her shoulder, his boots leaving deep tracks in the fresh powder. Behind them, Hinto followed silently, carrying Clara's medical kit. Inside the bunkhouse, the iron stove radiated welcome heat. Clara eased Eli onto a narrow bed, its springs creaking under his weight. In the lamplight, the gash above his temple looked angry and raw. "This needs cleaning," she said, dipping a cloth in warm water. As she dabbed at the wound, Eli winced but held still. "Want to tell me what happened out there?" Eli's eyes flickered. To Hinto, who had pressed himself into a corner, "Railroad men," he said, his voice rough. "3 of them found the boy near their work site." Clara's hand stilled. "They did this because of Hinto." Eli nodded slightly. "Said they wanted to teach him about trespassing." His jaw tightened. "I stepped in. Wasn't about to let them scare a child." 3 against 1, Clara muttered, applying salve to the cut. "That's mighty brave or mighty foolish." A ghost of a smile touched Eli's lips. "Reckon it's both." Through the night, snow fell steadily, piling in deep drifts against the bunkhouse walls. The wind moaned through the eaves, and Clara knew they were all trapped here until the weather cleared. Morning brought steel-gray skies and more snow. Clara trudged through knee-deep drifts to the bunkhouse, carrying a pot of steaming porridge. She found Eli already up, pulling on his coat. "And where do you think you're going?" she asked, setting down the pot. "Saw your woodpiles getting low," he said. "Need to earn my keep. You need to rest that head of yours." But Eli was already reaching for an axe. Clara sighed. "At least eat something first." She ladded out 3 bowls of porridge, calling Hinto in from where he'd been watching through the doorway. The boy accepted his bowl with a slight bow of thanks, then retreated to his corner to eat. Eli managed only 15 minutes of chopping before Clara spotted him swaying, one hand pressed to his temple. She hurried out, taking his arm. "That's enough. Back to bed." This time he didn't argue, letting her guide him inside. His face had gone pale beneath his beard, and he sank onto the bed with a poorly hidden grimace. Clara spent the afternoon in her kitchen, watching snow swirl past the windows while she wrote a letter to Reverend Matthews in town. Her pen scratched across the paper. "Dear Reverend, I have a young Lakota boy here, name of Hinto. Would you inquire if any of his people are camped nearby? He seems separated from his kin." The short winter day faded quickly into evening. After serving a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Clara noticed Eli shivering slightly despite the stove's heat. She fetched an extra blanket from her house, the wind catching at her skirts as she crossed the yard. When she draped the blanket over his shoulders, her fingers accidentally brushed his arm. Eli went rigid, as if her touch had burned him. But after a moment, he managed a quiet, "Much obliged." Clara stepped back, studying him. The gossip about him avoiding women suddenly seemed less like simple shyness. There was real pain there, old and deep. Hinto appeared in the kitchen doorway, watching them both with dark, careful eyes. The boy had barely spoken all day, but Clara had noticed how he tracked Eli's movements. Perhaps seeing something of himself in the man's wariness, the wind rattled the shutters, making them all jump. Clara moved to secure them, her mind turning over the mystery of her 2 unexpected guests. One running from something, one unable to touch or be touched, both carrying hurts she couldn't yet see. But for now, they were here, under her roof, and Clara Willoughby had never been one to turn away those in need. No matter what secrets they might carry, she stoked the stove one last time for the night, added another log. "Try to rest," she told them both. "Storm's not letting up any time soon." The lamp's glow softened the hard edges of Eli's face as he nodded. Even Hinto seemed to relax slightly, settling onto his pallet in the warm kitchen. Clara left them there, pushing through the snow toward her own house, wondering what tomorrow would bring with these 2 lost souls who'd landed on her doorstep. The next morning arrived like shattered glass, sharp-edged and brittle with cold. Clara's boots crunched through fresh snow as she made her way to the bunkhouse, her breath clouding in the steel-gray dawn. She found Eli already awake, sitting at the rough wooden table while Hinto crouched by the stove, feeding it small sticks. "Time to earn that bed," Clara said, hanging her heavy coat on a peg. "Stock needs feeding, and I've got harnesses that need mending." Eli stood, his height making the bunkhouse feel smaller. "Show me what needs doing." In the barn, sheep pressed against the fence as Clara demonstrated how to distribute hay. The familiar scent of livestock and sweet feed filled the cold air. Eli worked steadily, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the animals. Clara noticed how he favored his right side, the injury from yesterday still troubling him. "Sheep ain't particular pretty," she said, "but they're hardy, got through last winter when others lost their whole flocks." Eli nodded, watching Awe nose through the hay. "Been a while since I worked with animals. Most times it's just me and whatever I can trap." Inside the tack room, Clara showed him a pile of worn leather harnesses. "These need new stitching before spring work starts." She demonstrated the proper way to punch holes and thread the heavy needle. "My regular hands are out moving cattle to winter pasture. Won't be back for a week or more." Hinto appeared in the doorway, arms full of kindling. He spoke quietly in Lakota, words Clara couldn't understand as he arranged the wood in a neat pile. His small fingers worked quickly, sorting pieces by size. When the morning's work was done, Clara led them back to the house. The kitchen welcomed them with warmth and the rich smell of coffee. She poured 3 cups, setting milk and sugar on the table. Eli wrapped his hands around his cup, but didn't drink right away. "Been years since I worked alongside folks," he said finally. "Prefer keeping to myself up in the high country." "Solitude has its merits," Clara agreed, stirring sugar into her coffee. "After Thomas, my husband, passed from pneumonia 3 winters back, I thought about selling up, but this land gets in your blood." She glanced at the window, where snow still fell in lazy spirals. "2 hands help me run things now. Good men, both of them. But sometimes it feels like this place is held together by nothing but determination and baling wire." A horse's whinny cut through the quiet afternoon. Clara went to the window and saw a rider approaching, snow flying from his horse's hooves. "That'll be young Jimmy from town." She met him at the door. The boy's face was red with cold as he handed her a folded telegram from Reverend Matthews. "Ma'am," said it was important. Clara read the message twice, then thanked Jimmy with a couple of cookies for his trouble. Back inside, she shared the news. "Reverend says Hinto's grandfather is camped with other Lakota families near the old army post. It's 2 days' ride in good weather." Hinto looked up at the mention of his grandfather, hope flickering across his face. "We'll wait till this weather breaks," Clara decided. No sense risking the trail now. Evening drew in early, as it always did in December. Clara stirred a pot of thick beef stew while Eli split kindling into precise lengths, the kitchen filled with warmth and savory steam. Over bowls of stew and cornbread, Eli spoke more than he had all day. "Used to work for the railroad, years back," he said, breaking off a piece of bread. "The same one that's pushing toward Willow Pass now." Clara's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. The railroad meant progress, most folks said, but it also meant change, and not all of it good. She'd heard stories of broken treaties, of land grabs, and displaced families. "That was before," Eli added, quietly, not meeting her eyes. Before everything changed, Clara set down her spoon, studying him. There was more to his story. She could hear it in the weight of his words, see it in the way his shoulders tensed. But she didn't press. Some hurts needed time before they could be spoken aloud. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. Hinto moved closer to the stove, wrapping his blanket around his shoulders. The boy had been quiet all day, speaking only in his native tongue, but Clara had noticed how efficiently he worked, how carefully he observed everything around him. The evening settled into comfortable silence, broken only by the crack of burning wood in the stove and the hollow moan of wind across the prairie. Clara watched her unexpected guests, the giant of a man who carried hidden wounds, and the boy far from his people, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. Morning crept across the prairie, the pale winter sun casting long shadows across deep snowdrifts. Clara stood at her kitchen window, watching the light paint the white landscape in shades of pearl and gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. "I'll haul water," Eli announced, already pulling on his heavy coat. "Well, needs clearing anyway." Clara nodded, grateful for the help. "Buckets by the door. Mind the ice on those steps." Through the window, she watched his broad figure move through the snow. Toward the well, his footprints left deep impressions, each step deliberate and measured. The well's handle creaked as he worked, the sound carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. A movement near the barn caught her attention. Hinto had found a patch of bare earth where the wind had swept the ground clean. He crouched there, using a stick to draw in the dirt. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and made her way across the yard. The boy didn't look up as she approached, focused intently on his work. In the dirt, she saw the emerging shape of a hawk, its wings spread wide, each feather detailed with careful precision. The bird seemed almost ready to lift from the ground and take flight. "That's mighty fine work," Clara said softly, not wanting to startle him. "You've got a real gift there." Hinto glanced up briefly, a small smile touching his lips before he returned to his drawing. He added more details to the hawk's tail feathers, his small hands steady despite the cold. The morning passed in a rhythm of chores and quiet conversation. After the midday meal, Eli took Hinto outside, carrying a length of thin rope. Clara watched from the porch as the big man knelt in the snow beside the boy. "See here," Eli's deep voice carried across the yard. "First loop goes like this." His large hands moved slowly, demonstrating each step of setting a rabbit snare. Hinto leaned in close, eyes fixed on the rope as it took shape under Eli's guidance. "Now you try," Eli said, handing a piece of rope to the boy. Hinto's fingers, smaller, but just as careful, copied each movement. When he made a mistake, Eli gently corrected him, showing the proper way to tie the knot. Clara felt something warm settle in her chest at the sight. The giant of a man and the small boy, heads bent together over their task, sharing knowledge, as old as the hills themselves. It was a simple thing, this lesson in survival, but it spoke of trust beginning to grow. The short winter day faded quickly into evening. After supper, a hearty stew with the last of Clara's preserved vegetables. They gathered around the pot-bellied stove. The iron belly glowed red, throwing comfortable heat into the room. Outside, the temperature dropped sharply, making the window glass crackle. "Tell me about your trapping," Clara said, settling into her chair with her mending. "Must be peaceful." Up in those mountains, Eli sat quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames visible through the stove's grate. "It is," he finally answered. "Just you and the sky up there. No one to answer to but yourself and the good Lord." "What made you choose that life?" Clara kept her voice gentle, sensing the weight behind his words. His shoulders tensed slightly. "Railroad job ended, ... badly." He shifted in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "There was ... there was tragedy. Lost someone dear to me." His voice grew rough. "Don't much care to speak on it." Clara nodded, not pressing further. Some wounds needed darkness and silence to heal, like seeds waiting underground for spring. Had fallen asleep on his blanket near the stove, his face peaceful in the flickering light. Clara covered him with an extra quilt, careful not to wake him. Later that night, as Clara lay in her bed, she heard the soft crunch of boots in snow. Through her window, she caught glimpses of Eli's tall figure moving between the buildings. Checking the corrals and barn doors, he moved like a shadow in the moonlight, his breath visible in the cold air. In the distance, wolves called to each other across the vast prairie nights. Their voices echoed off the hills, wild and lonely. Clara listened to Eli's steady footsteps circling the ranch, a human counterpoint to the wolf song. There was something comforting in his vigilance. In knowing someone else watched while others slept, the night settled into stillness, broken only by the occasional wolf cry and the soft pad of Eli's boots. Clara drifted toward sleep, thinking of hawks drawn in dirt, rabbit snares, and the slow, careful way trust could grow between wounded souls. 2 days passed, and the sky finally cleared to a sharp winter blue. Clara watched the sunrise paint golden streaks across fresh snow, knowing they had their weather window at last. She'd spent the evening before making lists, supplies they'd need for the journey to the Lakota camp, provisions to stock before the next storm. "We'll head to town today," she announced over breakfast. Get what we need before taking Hinto home." The boy looked up from his porridge at the mention of his name, then returned to eating, his movements careful and measured. Eli nodded, already pulling on his heavy coat. "I'll get the wagon ready." The early morning air bit sharp as they harnessed the horses. Their breath came out in white clouds, mixing with the steam rising from the animals' flanks. Clara checked each buckle herself. Safety came first on winter roads. They set out just as dawn fully broke. The wagon wheels fought against frozen ruts, every bump sending jarring shocks through the wooden frame. Clara held the reins steady, guiding the team around the worst spots. Beside her, Eli sat silent and watchful, while Hinto huddled under blankets in the back dot by noon. The sun had climbed high, but offered little warmth. Clara pulled the wagon into a natural windbreak formed. By a stand of cottonwoods, their bare branches creaked overhead as she passed around biscuits left from breakfast. "Not much further now," she said, stamping her feet to keep warm. Eli took his biscuit with a quiet thank you, his eyes scanning the horizon as he ate. Pass came into view an hour later, smoke rising straight up from chimneys in the still air. As they passed the cafe, Clara noticed heads turning, voices dropping to whispers. Miss Peterson hurried across the street to speak with Mrs. Bradley, both women casting glances at the wagon. Sorted through her supply list with Mr. Jenkins, she overheard two men talking near the seed bins. "Saw that railroad foreman out by Willoughby's place yesterday," one said, marking boundaries with his crew. "That's so," replied the other. "Mighty interesting, that is." Clara glanced at Eli. His jaw had tightened, shoulders going rigid under his coat. He said nothing, but his eyes had taken on that distant look she was beginning to recognize. They worked through the list methodically. Flour, coffee, lamp oil, extra blankets for the journey. Mr. Jenkins wrapped each item carefully in brown paper. Clara paid from her carefully counted funds. Watching every penny, the short winter day was fading toward dusk as they loaded the last items. Clara hefted a heavy sack of flour, setting it carefully in the wagon bed. The street had mostly emptied, shopkeepers lighting their evening lamps. "Evening, ma'am," the voice came from behind her. Clara turned to find Marcus Thompson, the railroad foreman, standing there in his fine wool coat. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Thompson," she answered evenly, "been meaning to speak with you." He pulled a notebook from his pocket, making a show of consulting it. "Seems that spring of yours, the one feeding your north pasture, our surveys show it's on company land." Clara felt her chest tighten. That spring was the lifeblood of her ranch, especially in drought years. "That spring's been part of Willoughby land since my husband's father's time." Before Thompson could respond, Eli's massive frame stepped between them. He said nothing, but his presence alone made the foreman take a small step back. Thompson's smile turned sharp. "Well now, seems you've found yourself some interesting company, Mrs. Willoughby." He tucked his notebook away. "No matter, you'll be receiving the official papers soon enough. Company's got plans for that watershed." He touched the brim of his hat and walked away, boots clicking on the wooden sidewalk. Clara's hands shook slightly as she climbed onto the wagon seat. Eli helped Hinto up, then took his place beside her. The boy pressed close to her side, seeming to sense her distress. They drove home in tense silence. Clara hung the wagon's lantern, its light swinging with each bump and rut. The flame cast shifting shadows across their faces, across the fresh snow. In her mind, she kept seeing Thompson's smirk, hearing his casual threat wrapped in politeness. The horses' hooves beat a steady rhythm on the frozen ground. Up ahead, a coyote crossed their path, its eyes catching the lantern light before it disappeared into darkness. Clara held the reins tight, trying to focus only on getting them home safe through the gathering night. Morning light filtered through frost-covered windows. As Clara spread her deed papers across the kitchen table, her fingers traced the careful ink lines marking property boundaries, settling on the spring that fed her north pasture. The documents, yellowed but clear, showed her father-in-law's signature, the county clerk's stamp, and proper witnessing marks. "It's right here," she said, tapping the paper, clear as day. "The spring lies within our property line." Eli leaned over her shoulder, his presence solid and reassuring. "Might help to have folk from town verify the boundaries," he suggested quietly, "those who remember when the land was first marked." Clara nodded, rolling the papers carefully. Old Mr. Jenkins was here then, and Reverend Morrison, too. She tucked the documents into their tin case. They'd remember. Outside, fresh snow began drifting down, adding to the blanket already covering the yard. Clara pulled her shawl tighter as they made their way to the barn. The morning chores wouldn't wait, railroad troubles or no. Inside the barn's warmth, Hinto sat cross-legged on a hay bale, watching intently as Eli demonstrated how to repair a broken harness strap. The boy's dark eyes followed every movement of Eli's big hands as they worked the leather. "See here," Eli explained, voice gentle. "You punch the holes neat and even, then draw the new leather through." He guided Hinto's smaller hands, showing him how to make the repair strong and lasting. Clara paused in her own work, struck by the quiet tableau. The giant of a man, speaking softly to the boy who barely reached his elbow. Sharing knowledge passed down through generations of those who worked with horses and leather. That afternoon, while Hinto napped in the kitchen's warmth, Clara and Eli sat at the table drinking coffee. Steam rose from their cups as they discussed the railroad's claims. "They won't start with the law," Eli said, his voice heavy with experience. "They'll try to frighten you first, make you doubt yourself." He stared into his cup. "I've seen it before." "You think they'd forge documents?" Clara asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Wouldn't be the first time." Eli's knuckles whitened. Around his cup, "They have men who specialize in such things, make everything look proper and legal." The conversation halted at the sound of sleigh bells approaching. Through the window, they saw Reverend Morrison's cutter sliding to a stop. Runners cutting. Clean lines in the fresh snow. Clara hurried to open the door, welcoming the preacher in from the cold. His beard was frosted white, his cheeks red from the winter air. "Good news," he announced, warming his hands by the stove. "I've heard from Hinto's people. His grandfather will meet us at Eagle Creek Crossing in 3 days' time." The Reverend smiled at the boy, who had emerged from his nest of blankets. "He's eager to see you, young man." Hinto's face brightened at the news, though he remained silent. Clara saw him straighten, pride and longing visible in his bearing. 3 days, Clara repeated, mind already calculating. "That's good news indeed, but, ... She glanced toward the window, toward her vulnerable spring. "I can't leave the ranch, unguarded, not with Thompson's men watching." "I'll go with you," Eli said firmly. The others turned to look at him. "We can make it there and back within a week. Weather holds decent, we'll travel fast." Clara studied him, seeing the determination. "In his stance? You're sure?" He nodded. "The boy needs to be with his family, and 2 riders can move quicker than a wagon." He glanced at the Reverend. "If you'll witness these property lines before we go." Of course, Reverend Morrison agreed. "I remember well when old John Willoughby marked these boundaries. Happy to put my name to that truth, with witnesses to the property lines and Eli's offer of help. Perhaps they could manage both duties, protecting the ranch and helping Hinto home." "We'll need to prepare," she said, already making mental lists. "Food, blankets, extra ammunition." She looked at Hinto. "And warm clothes for you, young man. It's a cold ride ahead." The boy nodded solemnly, understanding at least the tone, if not all the words. Outside, the snow continued to fall, adding another layer of white to the world. Clara watched it through the window, knowing that somewhere out there, railroad men were plotting against her land. But here, in her kitchen, with these people gathered, around her table, she felt stronger than she had in days. They spent the rest of the evening making plans, the Reverend adding his knowledge of the trail ahead, while Eli drew rough maps in the margin of an old newspaper. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had a path forward, for both Hinto and the ranch. The winter sun traced pale arcs across the sky as Clara, Eli, and Hinto made their way toward Eagle Creek Crossing. Clara's wagon creaked over frozen ground. Every rut and stone felt through the wooden seat. Eli rode alongside on his bay gelding, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Hinto sat wrapped in blankets between them, quiet but alert. That first evening, they found shelter in a grove of cottonwoods. The trees' bare branches formed a natural windbreak, their trunks dark against the deepening blue of dusk. Clara's joints ached as she climbed down from the wagon seat, her breath clouding in the cold air. "Best spot we'll find," Eli said, already leading the horses to water at a nearby creek. The animal's hooves crunched through a thin sheet of ice. At the water's edge, Hinto helped gather fallen branches, while Clara unpacked their supplies. The boy moved with purpose, carefully selecting the driest wood he could find. Soon, Eli returned with his axe and began splitting larger logs for the night ahead. The rhythmic thunk of the axe accompanied Clara as she set up their camp. She arranged stones in a circle, cleared away snow, and laid out their bedrolls near where the fire would be. The familiar motions of preparing coffee brought comfort, measuring grounds into the pot, adding fresh water, setting it carefully. At the fire's edge, once Eli had the flames catching well, as darkness settled fully around them, they huddled near the fire's warmth. Hinto curled up closest to the flames, wrapped in his blanket like a sleeping cat. The firelight played across his young face, peaceful now in ways he hadn't been when they first found him. Clara poured coffee into tin cups, passing one to Eli. His fingers brushed hers briefly as he took it, and this time he didn't flinch away. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the pop and crackle of burning wood. The distant call of an owl, the second day's travel, proved easier. The terrain more familiar to Hinto, who pointed out landmarks he recognized. With the sun sliding toward the western hills, movement on the horizon caught their attention. 4 riders approached at an unhurried pace. Hinto straightened, eyes fixed on the approaching group, even at a distance. The dignity in the lead rider's bearing marked him as Red Elk. He rode a paint horse with practiced ease, 2 younger men flanking him, another following with a pack horse. They met in a small meadow where patches of grass showed through melting snow. Hinto waited until his grandfather dismounted before scrambling down from the wagon. Red Elk's weathered face softened as the boy approached, though their greeting was reserved. A gentle hand on Hinto's shoulder, quiet words in Lakota. "We give thanks," Red Elk said to Clara, his English careful but clear. "The boy is precious." To us, his dark eyes held wisdom and warmth as he inclined his head. Respectfully, Clara found herself touched by the simple sincerity of his words. "We're glad to help," she replied. "Hinto is a good boy." While the others began sharing food, dried meat, and fresh bread from Clara's kitchen, Red Elk drew Eli aside. Clara couldn't hear their words, but she watched as the 2 men walked a short distance away, speaking in low voices. Red Elk's gesture encompassed the sky, the earth, then settled over his heart. A man who carries guilt needs a place to lay it down. Red Elk's words carried just far enough for Clara to hear. She saw Eli's shoulders tense, then slowly relax as the older man continued speaking. The winter afternoon was fading when they finally prepared to part ways. Hinto had already mounted behind his grandfather, but he turned back to wave at Clara and Eli. His smile, though small, held genuine warmth. Clara watched until the riders disappeared into the gathering dusk before climbing back into her wagon. The moon was rising, full and bright enough to light their way home. Without Hinto's slight weight beside her, the seat felt strangely empty. Eli rode closer to the wagon now, his presence steady in the growing darkness. Something had shifted. In him, during that conversation with Red Elk, a subtle easing of the tension he usually carried. "He's a wise man," Clara said softly, glancing at her companion. Eli nodded, his face thoughtful in the moonlight. "He sees clear," he replied after a moment, "sees what needs seeing." They traveled on under that bright moon, the wagon lighter, without their young passenger, but their hearts fuller for having helped him home. The night was cold but clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the dark sky, guiding them back toward Clara's ranch and whatever challenges awaited them there. The moon hung low on the horizon as Clara's wagon approached her ranch. Something felt wrong before she could put words to it. The front gate stood open, swaying slightly in the night breeze. Eli noticed, too. He straightened in his saddle, one hand moving to his rifle. "Stay here," he murmured, but Clara was already climbing down from the wagon. Together they approached the barn, their boots crunching in the snow. The large door hung crooked on its hinges, creaking with each gust of wind. Clara's heart pounded as she lifted her lantern, its yellow light sweeping across the familiar space. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls. Feed bins stood undisturbed. Tack hung in its proper place along the walls. Nothing seemed missing, but the air felt wrong, like a stranger's footprints in fresh snow. "Eli!" Clara called softly. He appeared at her shoulder, following her gaze. "To the back door. It stood open to the pasture beyond, where their spring bubbled up from the earth. They found the evidence, their patch of earth, churned up by hooves, the spring's banks, trampled and muddy. Eli crouched down, studying the ground in the lantern light. His finger traced the outline of a horseshoe print pressed deep into the soft earth. 2 horses, he said quietly. Both shod, came from town direction. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. Railroad men? Clara's stomach clenched. The foreman's threat in town hadn't been idle talk. Marking boundaries, she said, her voice tight with anger. On my land, we'll watch closer now, Eli replied. His usual stillness had an edge to it, like a drawn bowstring. They secured the barn for the night, checking every latch twice. Clara lay awake long after the lantern was extinguished. Listening to the wind and thinking of hoofprints in the mud, the next days fell into a pattern of vigilance. Clara and Eli worked side by side from sunup to sundown, keeping the ranch running while watching for unwelcome visitors. They mended the broken fence along the south pasture, Eli's strong hands showing Clara how to splice the wire just so. They gathered firewood, their axe strokes falling into rhythm as they built up the winter store. Each morning and evening, they checked the spring. Clara found herself studying Eli's face during these walks, noting how his guard seemed to lower bit by bit in her presence. His shoulders lost some of their tension. His movements became more fluid, less controlled. "Reckon we ought to check the north fence today," Clara said one morning over breakfast. She poured coffee into Eli's cup, strong and black as she always made it. He took a sip and coughed dramatically. "Could stand spoons up in this brew," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching. Clara raised an eyebrow. "That's the first time you've complained about my coffee." Eli Gray. "Not complaining," he replied, taking another deliberate drink. "Might need it to dissolve some rust off them fence posts, though." A surprised laugh escaped her. His eyes crinkled at the corners, and for a moment she glimpsed the man he might have been before whatever tragedy had shaped him. They settled into an easy routine. Clara found herself looking forward to their shared tasks, even the mundane ones. Eli's presence became familiar, comfortable, like a well-worn saddle or favorite quilt. He anticipated her needs, passing tools before she asked, steadying loads without being told. One evening, after checking the spring one final time, they paused to watch the sunset, paint the sky in streaks of pink and gold. The air was sharp with coming frost, their breath visible in small clouds. Clara felt the warmth of him beside her, solid and reassuring. Without thinking, she placed her hand on his arm. In the past, such contact would have made him stiffen or pull away. This time he remained still, accepting her touch. The moment stretched between them, delicate as spun glass. Clara felt the wool of his coat beneath her fingers, the strength of the arm beneath. When she finally let her hand fall away, the air seemed colder for its absence. They walked back to the house in companionable silence, their shadows long in the fading light. The ranch was quiet around them, secure for another night. But Clara knew the railroad men would return the churned. Earth by the Spring was only their opening move in a game she was determined not to lose. A week before Christmas, dark clouds rolled across the morning sky, bringing the sharp smell of coming snow. Clara stood at her kitchen window, watching as 3 wagons approached her ranch. The Thompson family led the group, followed by the Hendersons and old Mike Wheeler. They'd heard about the storm damage to her north fence and came bearing tools and willing hands. "Looks like we've got company," Clara called to Eli, who was stoking the stove fire. He moved to the window, his large frame casting a shadow. "Good people," he said quietly, already reaching for his coat. The work party spread out along the damaged fence line, where last week's storm had torn posts from the frozen ground and scattered rails across the snow. Sarah Thompson's boys scrambled to gather the scattered wood while their father directed the repairs. Eli worked alongside them, his strength making quick work of the heavy lifting. Clara watched him with the others, noting how he seemed different today. His shoulders weren't as tense. His responses to questions came more readily. When young Tommy Henderson dropped a post on his foot, Eli's deep laugh joined the others. By midday, the smell of Clara's beef stew drew everyone toward the house. She'd been cooking since dawn, knowing her neighbors wouldn't leave without being fed. It was the way of things out here. Work shared, food shared, burdens made lighter by many hands. "You'll all stay for dinner," she announced, though it wasn't really a question. Steam rose from the pot as she ladled stew into tin bowls, the rich aroma of beef and vegetables filling the warm kitchen. The group crowded around her table, passing cornbread and swapping stories. Eli sat between Mike Wheeler and John Thompson, joining their discussion about winter tracking conditions. His voice carried more easily now, offering details about game trails he'd found in the high country. "Never seen a man read sign like Eli. Here," Mike declared, sopping up gravy with his bread, "showed me where a mountain lion had been stalking my sheep last month. Save me losing half my flock, I reckon." Clara hid her smile, seeing Eli's ears redden at the praise. He'd begun to shed that mantle of solitude, piece by piece, like spring ice breaking up on the river. The afternoon passed quickly. As the last wagon disappeared down the road, fresh snow began to fall. Clara and Eli brought in more firewood, working in comfortable silence until the woodbox was full. The house creaked and settled around them as darkness gathered outside. Clara added another log to the fire, watching the flames leap up. Eli sat in the chair opposite, his large hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. The firelight caught the silver threading through his dark beard, the quiet strength in his face. Something in the moment felt right, like a key fitting into a lock. "Eli," she said softly, "will you tell me what happened with the railroad?" He went still, his cup frozen halfway to his mouth. For a long moment, only the fire's crackling broke the silence. Then he set the cup down, his movements careful and deliberate. "Had a fiancée," he began, his voice rough. "Sarah was her name. She worked in the camp kitchen, saving for our wedding." He stared into the fire, seeing something far away. Railroad was pushing hard for deadlines, offering bonuses for early completion. Clara waited, her hands folded in her lap. "There was talk," he continued. "Some men planned to raid the camp, scare the workers into working faster. Thought, fear, would speed things up." His fingers tightened around the cup. "I knew about it, kept quiet. Those bonuses would have given us a proper start." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, wind whistled through the eaves. They came at night, meant to fire shots in the air, break some equipment. His voice dropped lower. "Sarah was carrying water to the cookhouse. Someone's horse spooked. She was." He swallowed hard. "She died in my arms." Clara's heart ached at the raw pain in his words. 10 years of silence hadn't dulled that edge. "I could have warned them," he said. "Could have stopped it. But I wanted that money. My silence killed her sure as any bullet." "Eli." Clara leaned forward, her eyes soft with understanding. "You were young, trying to build a future. You couldn't have known." He shook his head. "Should have chosen different. Should have spoken up." "Maybe so," Clara said gently. "But silence doesn't have to be the rest of your story. You're not that same young man anymore." Eli looked up then, meeting her gaze. Something shifted in his expression, like ice beginning to thaw. "Feels like betraying her memory," he admitted. "Being happy again?" "No," Clara said firmly. "Living in guilt betrays the love she had for you. Living fully that honors her memory." The fire crackled between them, warm and steady. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet white. In that moment, Clara saw tears glisten in Eli's eyes, quickly blinked away. But his shoulders seemed lighter, as if setting down a burden carried too long. Christmas Eve dawned bright and cold, the morning sun glinting off fresh snow. Clara woke early, breathing in the crisp December air that seeped through her window frame. The kitchen soon filled with the warm scent of rising dough as she prepared bread for the evening's gathering. Through the window, she watched Eli trudging through knee-deep snow, dragging a small pine tree he'd cut from the north ridge. His broad shoulders were dusted white, his breath forming clouds in the winter air. He'd insisted on finding the perfect tree for her parlor, though she hadn't celebrated Christmas properly since losing her husband. "This spot," Eli asked, positioning the pine near the window. Pine needles scattered across the floor, filling the room with their fresh scent. Clara nodded, wiping flour from her hands. "Perfect." She hesitated, then added, "It's been a while since this house felt like Christmas." By late afternoon, neighbors began arriving in sleighs and wagons, their runners and wheels crunching through the snow. The Thompsons brought strings of dried cranberries for the tree. Sarah Henderson carried a basket of sugar cookies, Old Mike Wheeler contributed a jug of his famous cider. Lantern light spilled from Clara's windows as the house filled with warmth and conversation. Someone started playing Silent Night on the parlor piano, and voices joined in, creating a gentle harmony that filled every corner. Clara watched Eli from across the room, noting how he'd trimmed his beard and wore his good shirt. He still kept to the edges of the crowd, but his eyes found hers often carrying unspoken words. "Time for dancing," Sarah Henderson called out, as her husband struck up a tune on his fiddle. Clara felt a presence at her elbow. Eli stood there, his large hands working nervously at his vest buttons. "Would you, ... He cleared his throat. She slipped her hand into his, feeling the calluses on his palm. His other hand settled carefully at her waist, treating her like spun glass. Their steps were awkward at first, Eli counting under his breath, Clara trying not to laugh as they bumped into other couples, but gradually they found their rhythm, moving together in slow circles while neighbors smiled and nodded approvingly. "You dance better than you let on," Clara teased. "Had a good teacher," he replied softly. His eyes warmed as the evening wound down and guests departed into the clear night. Clara and Eli remained by the fire. The Christmas tree glowed with candles, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Neither seemed eager to end the evening. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, "for making this Christmas feel like home again." Eli's response was interrupted by a sharp movement outside the window shadows, shifting against the moonlit snow. Before either could investigate, an orange glow lit up the yard. "Fire!" Eli's shout shattered the peaceful moment. The hay barn. They burst outside into bitter cold. Flames were already climbing the barn's wooden walls, consuming the dry hay. Inside, the horses screamed in terror, trapped in their stalls. The horses. Clara ran toward the inferno, but Eli caught her arm. "I'll get them. You pump water." Clara raced to the well, while Eli disappeared into the smoke-filled barn. The hand pump creaked with each desperate stroke, but she knew it was futile. The flames were too fierce, too hungry. Eli emerged, leading to horses, their eyes rolling white with fear. He dove back in for the others. Clara's heart pounded as the roof timbers began to crack and groan. "Eli, get out of there!" He stumbled out with the last horse, just as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. They could only watch as the barn filled with winter hay and tools burned to the ground. In the chaos, neither noticed the small figure approaching until he spoke. Clara Hinto's voice was barely a whisper. They turned to find the Lakota boy standing in the snow, shivering in clothes. Too thin for the weather, his face was streaked with tears and soot. Clara rushed to wrap her shawl around his shoulders. "What are you doing here? Where's your grandfather?" "Bad man," he managed, in broken English. "At camp, say move, or else." He pointed at the burning barn like this. Eli's face darkened with understanding. "Railroad men?" Hinto nodded, pressing closer to Clara. "Grandfather say stay calm, but I scared. I run." Clara held the boy tighter, sharing a grim look with Eli over his head. The railroad was escalating first threats, then trespassing, and now arson. They were targeting not just her ranch, but anyone who might stand in their way. The barn continued to burn against the star-filled sky, its heat pushing back the winter cold. As Clara comforted Hinto and Eli tended to the frightened horses, the perfect peace of their Christmas Eve lay in ashes around them. Yet somehow, facing this threat together felt stronger than facing it alone. Dawn was still hours away, but none of them would sleep. There were horses to settle, authorities to notify, and a frightened boy to protect. Their Christmas celebration had turned to crisis, but they would face it as they had faced everything else dashed together. Morning light revealed the full devastation of the fire. The barn was nothing more than a blackened skeleton, wisps of smoke still rising from the ruins. Clara stood in the yard, her throat tight as she calculated the losses. The winter hay gone, tools passed down from her father. The roof that had sheltered generations of horses collapsed into ash. Hinto huddled near the house, watching her with worried eyes. The boy hadn't slept, jumping at every creak and shadow through the night. Clara's own rest had been fitful, her mind racing with fears. About feeding her stock through the cruel months ahead, Eli emerged from checking the remaining outbuildings, his face grim. "Clara," he said softly, approaching her. "Without that hay, I know." She swallowed hard. I'll have to sell half the herd, maybe more. The words hurt to say aloud. Each animal represented years of careful breeding, of early mornings and late nights, of her husband's dreams for their future. Selling now, in winter, when prices were low, meant taking a heavy loss. There might be another way. Eli's voice was determined. Let me ride to town. The merchants know youth, they might extend credit, and I can find out why the railroad's pushing so hard for your land. Clara's head snapped up. The roads aren't safe. Those men who burned the barn could still be out there, which is exactly why I need to go. Eli's jaw set in a stubborn line. We need to know what we're facing. Clara couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Eli met her eyes steadily. Yes, I ain't leaving you to face this alone. Heat rose in Clara's cheeks, but worry still gnawed at her. At least wait until tomorrow. The weather, every day we wait, is another day your stock goes hungry. Eli was already moving toward the stable. I can make town by nightfall if I leave now. Clara watched him saddle his horse, his movements quick and sure. Hinto crept closer, his small face pinched with concern. Eli knelt before the boy, his voice gentle. I'll be back soon, young warrior. You keep watch over Clara for me. Hinto nodded solemnly, straightening his shoulders at the responsibility. Be careful, Clara said softly as Eli mounted. Those railroad men, they're desperate enough to burn a barn. No telling what else they might do. I can handle railroad men. His tone was grim, weighted with memory. Then his expression softened. Take care of each other. I'll bring help. Clara and Hinto stood watching until Eli's figure disappeared into the winter landscape. The day stretched long before them, filled with the grim work of salvage. Clara picked through the barn's remains, setting aside tools that might be saved. Hinto followed, carrying smaller items to a pile by the house. They found a few pitchforks, with scorched handles but solid tines. A box of horse liniment had survived, protected by its metal container. Each small recovery felt like a victory against despair. By afternoon, exhaustion dragged at Clara's limbs. Her hands were black with soot, her back aching from bending and lifting. She'd been pushing away thoughts of Eli all day, trying not to imagine what might happen if he encountered trouble on the road. Hinto helped her feed the horses their meager rations, his small face serious as he measured out each portion. The boy's presence was a comfort. His quiet strength reminded her so much of Eli. Night fell early, as it always did, in December. Clara lit the lamps and prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. Hinto picked at his food, his eyes constantly drawn to the window. He will come back, the boy said suddenly. In careful English, Clara reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Yes, he will. After the dishes were done, Clara settled in her chair by the fire. The flames reminded her too much of the barn burning, but they needed the warmth. Hinto curled up nearby, wrapped in a quilt. Almost without meaning to, Clara began to pray aloud. Lord, watch over him on the road. Her voice caught. Keep him safe from those who mean harm. Bring him back too, she stopped, surprised by the depth of emotion in her own words. Hinto's quiet breathing told her he had finally fallen asleep. Clara remained by the fire, listening to the wind and thinking of a lone rider somewhere in the darkness, carrying their hopes for salvation. The railroad's aggression made more sense. Now they needed her spring for their steam engines. Without it, their planned route would have to shift miles east, costing them fortunes in construction and lost time. But understanding didn't make their tactics any less cruel. Clara touched her mother's Bible, drawing comfort from its worn leather cover. Just bring him home safe, she whispered into the quiet room. Please, just bring him home. 3 days crawled by like molasses in winter. Clara kept the home fires burning, though her heart grew heavier with each sunset that brought no sign of Eli. The neighbors had been kind, bringing spare hay for the livestock and helping with the heaviest chores, but their worried glances told her they feared the worst. Hinto stayed close to her side, his quiet presence a comfort. He helped feed the chickens and watched the road with sharp eyes, refusing to give up hope. Each evening, he would climb to the hayloft of the remaining stable, scanning the horizon until Clara called him in for supper. On the 4th day, the weather turned mean. The wind picked up from the north, carrying bitter cold that cut through wool and leather alike. Clara's fingers ached as she drew water from the well, ice forming on the rope before she could coil it away. "Storm's coming," old Bill Matthews warned when he stopped by with more hay. "Bad one, too. You best get everything tied down tight." Clara nodded, trying to hide her growing fear. If Eli was still on the road when this hit, she pushed the thought away and focused on preparations. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of a bruise. The wind howled around the corners of the house, finding every crack and whistle. Clara added extra wood to the stove and lit all the lamps early, their warm glow a defiance against the gathering dark. Hinto huddled near the window, breath frosting the glass as he kept his vigil. Clara was just about to call him to supper when he suddenly straightened. "Listen," he said, pressing closer to the pane and closer to the pane. At first, Clara heard only the wind. Then the distinct rhythm of hoofbeats, growing closer through the storm. She grabbed her shawl and rushed to the door, Hinto right behind her. The cold hit like a slap as she stepped onto the porch. Holding the lamp high, a horse emerged from the swirling snow, its rider hunched against the weather. Clara's heart leaped as she recognized Eli's broad shoulders. He wasn't alone. Another figure rode double behind him, clinging to his coat. "Thank the Lord," Clara breathed. Hurrying down the steps, Eli dismounted stiffly, his clothes crusted with ice. He helped his passenger down, a thin man Clara didn't recognize, who stumbled slightly on frozen legs. "Clara," Eli said, his voice rough from the cold. "This here's Mr. Jenkins, railroad surveyor." The man nodded, teeth chattering. "Mom." "Inside, all of you," Clara ordered, ushering them toward the warmth. "You'll catch your death out here." Once in the house, she set about brewing coffee while the men thawed near the stove. Hinto brought blankets, and soon color began returning to their wind-chapped faces. "Show her," Eli said to Jenkins after his second cup of coffee. The surveyor reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, handling it carefully despite his trembling hands. "The original survey," he explained, spreading it on the table. "With my signature, an official seal, it shows clear as day your spring lies a good quarter-mile inside your property line." Clara studied the document, hope rising in her chest. "And you'll testify to this?" Jenkins glanced nervously at the window. "That's why we rode through the storm. The foreman, he knows I made copies. Been threatening me, saying I'd lose more than my job if I didn't destroy them." "You're safe here," Eli said firmly. "Come morning, we'll ride to the marshal's office. Get this properly witnessed and recorded." Clara looked up at him, seeing the exhaustion etched in his face. "What happened in town?" "Took some convincing to find someone willing to stand against the railroad," Eli said grimly. "But Mr. Jenkins, here he's got a conscience and a family to think about. Couldn't stomach being part of stealing a widow's water rights." Jenkins nodded. "The foreman's been falsifying surveys all along the line, taking what he wants, thinking no one would dare speak up. But this time, he squared his shoulders. This time, there's proof." Clara's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "Both of you." Eli met her gaze, something warm kindling in his eyes despite his wariness. "Told you I'd bring help." "That you did." Clara smiled, then turned brisk. "Now, let's get some food in you before you fall over. Hinto, help me with the stew." The boy nodded eagerly, already heading for the kitchen. Soon, the house was filled with the homey sounds and smells of supper being prepared, while outside the storm raged on, unable to touch the hope that burned bright within. Dawn broke over. Willow Pass with ribbons of pink and gold threading through storm-cleared skies. Clara gripped the survey papers, tight as their wagon rolled into town. Eli's solid presence beside her lending strength. Jenkins huddled in the back, his face pale but determined. The cafe's morning crowd spilled onto the boardwalk as they passed. Mrs. Peterson dropped her broom, hurrying inside to spread the word. By the time Clara pulled the wagon to a stop, faces peered from every storefront. "Reckon word travels fast," Eli murmured, helping Clara down from the seat. The cafe door banged. "Open!" The railroad foreman strutted out, thumbs hooked in his vest. "Well, if it ain't the widow Willoughby," he drawled. "Come to surrender that spring claim." Clara squared her shoulders, unfolding the survey paper with steady hands. The growing crowd formed a half circle, their whispers falling silent as she cleared her throat. "I've come to set things right," she said, her voice carrying across the street. "This here's the original survey, signed and sealed by your own surveyor, Mr. Jenkins." The foreman's smirk faltered as Jenkins emerged from the wagon. Clara began reading, each word clear and strong. "The spring in question lies precisely 27 chains within the Willoughby property line, as established by the Territorial Survey of 1873. That paper ain't worth spit," the foreman spat, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Preacher Roberts stepped forward, his Bible tucked under one arm. "I've known Clara Willoughby 15 years. Her words, gospel truth in these parts, as has her deed," Sheriff Taylor added, pushing through the crowd, "which matches that survey exactly." Townspeople nodded, pressing closer. Mrs. Peterson spoke up from the cafe steps. "That spring's been Willoughby water since before you railroad men came sniffing around." The foreman's face darkened as he looked from face to face, finding no allies. His hand twitched toward his gun, but Eli shifted slightly, his massive frame a quiet warning. "This ain't over," the foreman growled, but he backed away. Shouldering roughly through the crowd, Clara lowered the papers, her hands trembling now that the confrontation was done. "Thank you all," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "For standing with me." The gathered townspeople smiled and nodded, some stepping forward to pat her shoulder or clasp her hand. In that moment, Clara felt the full strength of community warming her like summer sun after a long winter. The January thaw crept in like a gentle whisper, softening the snow's harsh edges around Clara's ranch. Morning sun glinted off patches of exposed earth where boot prints marked paths between buildings. The sound of hammers rang clear across the yard as neighbors worked to raise the new barn's frame. Eli moved among them like a giant. His shirt sleeves rolled despite the lingering chill. Sweat gleamed on his forearms as he lifted boards into place. Clara watched from her spot on the porch, a steaming coffee pot warming her hands. Her heart lifted at the sight of Hinto, darting between the workers, carrying nails and tools with fierce determination. "Mind them splinters, young fella," Eli called out, and Hinto's answering grin lit up his face. Clara poured fresh coffee into tin cups, carrying them out to the workers. The rich aroma mixed with fresh-cut pine and wood shavings. She paused to watch Eli demonstrate to Hinto how to check if a board was true, their heads bent together in concentration. When Eli laughed at something the boy said, the sound carried across the yard like music. The sun began its slow descent as the last board settled into place. Neighbors gathered their tools, accepting Clara's thanks with warm handshakes and promises to return if needed. Soon only the three of them remained. Standing in the shadow of the new barn, Hinto ran inside to explore, his footsteps echoing off fresh timber. Eli approached Clara slowly, his eyes holding something she hadn't seen before. "Hope, Miss Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been thinking on things." She waited, her heart beating quick and steady. "This here ranch," he continued, "it's a place where a man can breathe free, where touch ain't forbidden." He swallowed hard. "Where shame don't have no hold." Clara's eyes softened as understanding dawned. "Would you let me stay?" he asked. "Here, where a man can touch and be touched without shame." In answer, Clara reached out and took his work-roughened hand in hers. His fingers curled around hers, gentle despite their strength. Together, they stood watching the sunset paint the sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold. The ranch lay quiet around them, but it wasn't the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the peaceful hush of home, alive with all the promise of spring waiting to unfold. If this one resonated with you, stick around. I've got another story waiting for you tomorrow, and who knows, it might be just what you needed to hear.